Have you ever been curious about hybrids, what they are, where they come from, and exactly how they're done? Drex here from DrexFactor.com, and in today's installment of the Poi Explainer, we're going to talk about one of the most ubiquitous tricks in the tech Poi world. Before we dive in, I just want to give a shout out to the friends of the channel. Big thanks to Darkmonk, Flow Toys, Pyroterra Light Toys, LMF Props, Spinballs, and Ultrapoi for helping to make the videos on this channel possible. You can learn more about all these awesome companies and the work they're doing to support flow artists like yourself by checking out the links down in the description of this video. Hybrids have been around for more than 15 years, and in that time, the term has gotten tossed around, defined, and then redefined, and of course, fleshed out by countless artists all over the world. I would venture to say that no concept in the tech Poi world has been as controversial or as difficult to define as hybrids have been, but I'm still going to try and give you as complete an understanding of them as I possibly can. For today's video, I'm going to go with the following definition to help us narrow down the scope of what we're looking at. A hybrid is the juxtaposition of two or more distinct Poi patterns so as to synchronize the completion of one or more elements of each pattern. That's a lot of word vomit, so let's put that into layman's terms. We talked a bit about Poi patterns, and more specifically elementary Poi patterns in my explainer video on caps. I'll link to it for anybody who wants a refresher, but simply put, we can define what constitutes a pattern mathematically in a way that makes it easy for us to distinguish them from combos or other more complex patterns. So what makes a Poi pattern distinct? So this becomes a bit of a rabbit hole, and it's difficult to create a hard and fast definition that will please everyone. But here's the way I view it. For the two patterns in a hybrid to be considered distinct, they must be incongruent, radially asymmetric, and/or locally distinct. Two patterns may be similar, but not congruent. For example, isolations and extensions are both patterns that result in circular paths, but because they're different sizes, they are incongruent and thus distinct. And while cateyes and horizontal cateyes are congruent, they are not radially symmetrical to each other. I can rotate either cateye 180 degrees to get the same pattern, but I cannot rotate either cateye within its own radial symmetry to arrive at the other. So while vertical cateyes that are rotated 180 degrees from each other are not a hybrid when combined, a horizontal cateye combined with a vertical cateye is because the two patterns are 90 degrees offset from each other and thus distinct. Finally, there are cases in which sections of distinct patterns are performed together, but do not complete. In this case, we recognize the patterns as being distinct due to their local characteristics. For example, if I perform two C-caps with the Poi opposites in my hands and together same, the patterns involved overall appear to be both congruent and radially symmetrical. However, we can see each local section of the caps contrast antispin and extension movements, which are distinct from each other. For as complicated as this definition is, it also leaves open the door for some very strange things to be considered hybrids, but we'll get into that in a few minutes. One other quick note here, and that's to point out that a lot of older discussions of hybrids use a term called driving styles to describe the different Poi patterns in hybrids. Because there was never a solid definition outlined for this term, I'm replacing it here with distinct patterns because I've set out what I think are three solid diagnostic characteristics. But for all intents and purposes, if you're digging into old posts on these topics, you should consider the term driving style to more or less mean the same thing as distinct pattern. So now there's the final piece of that definition, synchronizing the pattern. While we can definitely just perform any two patterns against each other, in a lot of cases, the result just looks like garbage. We as humans are looking for some signal in the noise, and whether we're synchronizing the completion of patterns, timing and direction of the Poi, or timing and direction of the hands, it helps to produce results that actually look pleasing to the eye. And for our final bit of background, we need to outline hybrid nomenclature. It's very rare that hybrids have unique names like the weave or butterfly, so in many cases we refer to them by way of the two patterns that make them up. So for example, we would refer to this hybrid as cap versus pendulum or pendulum versus cap. There is no standard for which name must come first, so either name is accepted. So with that established, let's dive into the origins and evolution of hybrids. The very first hybrid was discovered by Poi spinner and meteor enthusiast Andy House. While I can't find video of him performing it, this is Nick Woolsey showing this trick off in a tutorial, outlining the techniques that Andy taught him for learning them. As he played with his meteor, he realized that if he produced an isolated motion with one end of the prop, the other end would wind up in an extension. It seemed likely that the same idea could be accomplished with Poi. He also noticed something very odd about this move. The hands appear to be moving in together time same direction. The Poi, however, are spinning in split time same direction. This was kind of a surprise because at the time, the Poi world was dominated by flowers, weaves, butterflies, and other tricks where the timing and direction of the Poi and hands are the same. Andy had discovered something that's proven to be a trait shared by a great many hybrids. By contrasting two patterns that are distinct, you frequently wind up in situations where the hands and Poi are in differing timing and direction combinations. And of of course, this also opened the door to other people creating tricks by juxtaposing two patterns together. In many cases, tech poi spinners eager to unlock all the possible hybrids would create what's called a shape matrix, basically a list of every distinct pattern they knew so they could outline every possible combination of these patterns. The results from doing this were somewhat mixed. Sometimes it would open up a creative new hybrid, and sometimes the results would just look like random spinning. But it introduced a more mathematical and scientific type of thinking to the tech poi world that would inspire countless poi scholars to turn a chart on a piece of paper into a tool every bit as important to poi spinning as the poi themselves. And it meant that you could now discover new poi tricks by manipulating variables as well as just tinkering around with your props. One early application for hybrids came about when it was discovered that not only could you contrast tricks of different sizes together, you could also contrast tricks with different numbers of beats together. One such example is perhaps the most popular hybrid, TRIQUETRA versus extension, or as it's sometimes called, the Mercedes. TRIQUETRAs are a two downbeat move. That is, there are two moments in them where the poi pass underneath the hand. Extensions, on the other hand, are a single downbeat move. There is only one point when the poi passes underneath the hand. When performed together, the TRIQUETRA does twice as many downbeats as the extension in the same amount of time. Hence, polyrhythms. That also means the poi in the TRIQUETRA is spinning nearly twice as fast as the poi in the extension. Learning to find a balance between these two paces is an essential skill for anyone who learns this trick. And it turns out, all polyrhythm hybrids have something very interesting in common. They switch between different timing and direction combinations. For example, in the Mercedes, when the poi are both near the top, they're spinning in together opposite. When they're near the bottom, they're in split time opposite. Notice how they both reach up together at the top, but one is up and the other is down at the bottom? This makes polyrhythm hybrids great transition tools between tricks as well. As people began looking at hybrids on a deeper level, they worked not only to contrast different poi moves against each other, but also to group together similar hybrids. This led to the emergence of the first poi frameworks and theories to explain both how all the existing hybrids fit together and also how you could predict new ones to learn. Perhaps my favorite example of this in action, it was one of the first frameworks that I ever learned, Alien John's unit circle theory. In a post to the Tech Poi group on the now-defunct tribe.net, John outlined a family of hybrids that all shared several traits in common. Number 1. All the elementary patterns these hybrids were made up of were single-beat moves. Number 2, all of them shared hand paths that were one poi length across. There were 4 tricks that fit into this category: isolations, extensions, and what at the time were little-known curiosities called CATEYEs and their horizontal equivalent. John then pointed out that you could essentially come up with a system for outlining every combination of these tricks that existed according to the relative direction and phasing of the poi in relation to the hands. I'm going to leave a link down in the description to John's original post so you can go through it yourself, but essentially it introduced the poi world to several new hybrids. Bear in mind that for each of the hybrids I'm about to describe, there will be 4 variations, one for each of the timing and direction combinations the hands can be performing. So, for example, I can perform Andy House's isolation versus extension hybrid in its original form with the hands in together same, or with them in together opposite, split time opposite, or split time same direction. There's also isolation versus CATEYE, a personal favorite of mine. The hands together version of this is an enormous challenge from a timing perspective. And of course, isolation versus horizontal CATEYE. I can remember a time when I could count on my fingers the total number of people in the world that could perform this hybrid, and it's still incredibly rare. It's so hard to do that I'm only going to show you this one version. See if you can unlock the other variations for yourself. Of course, John's framework also opened us up to the world of extension versus CATEYE, extension versus horizontal CATEYE, and one of the most difficult hybrids I've ever had to learn, vertical versus horizontal CATEYE. So many options to choose from. Another great thing about the unit circle framework was that it was also the first framework to outline transitions between hybrids. If I perform CATEYE versus extension in one unit circle, you can imagine there being another unit circle right next to it that I could switch into. This will swap which hand is doing the CATEYE and which hand is doing the extension. You can actually map out how these different patterns overlap in neighboring circles to create tons of fun transitions going through multiple different hybrids. Now, you'll notice that several of these unit circle hybrids I demonstrated have something in common: the appearance of a point of contact between one of the poi and the opposite hand. These all belong to a subset of hybrids now called antibrids, and the reason for that is actually kind of my fault. Very early on in the history of my YouTube channel, I was told that a hybrid I'd shown off in a video was an antibrid. I didn't look too deeply into the definition of the trick and just assumed that it meant that point of contact. I've never actually been able to find a single definition for what antibrid meant at the time, but I've also seen people talk about the term meaning a hybrid in which an antispin pattern is employed. That's a pretty broad definition, so I'm kind of glad it actually fell out of favor. There was another term used for this same concept in this era, head orbiting moves. The idea being that you're getting one poi to orbit around the head of the opposite poi. It's also a little bit of a mouthful, so I'm kind of glad that antibrids became the term of choice. I've used it ever since, and being as how this is a branch of the poi family tree that I've explored in great detail, the name wound up sticking. Hybrids that fit into this family include pendulum versus cap, what I would consider to be the foundational antibrid. There's also TRIQUETRA versus static spin, one of my favorites to bust out during a performance. And also pendulum versus CATEYE, pendulum versus extension, pendulum versus TRIQUETRA. There are so many of these! I actually have a playlist of different videos I've done purely on the topic of antibrids, so you should check those out if you want to go down the rabbit hole with me. About the same time I was starting my deep dive into the antibrid world, a crew of poi spinners based in Oakland, California were doing a deep dive of their own. They used some of the same techniques Alien John did for breaking up hybrids according to the timing and direction of the hands in poi, but instead of focusing on single beat patterns, they instead focused on flowers. This approach to exploring, categorizing, and creating transitions between hybrids was named after the loft complex that the artists lived in, and to this day we still refer to it as the VULCAN Tech Gospel, or VTG for short. One of my favorite VTG hybrids is 4-pedal antispin versus 2-pedal inspin with the hands in split time opposites. And it's here that we encounter an interesting hiccup in the hybrid definition that I outlined at the beginning of this video. This is diamond mode versus box mode 4-pedal antispin. This hasn't traditionally been considered a hybrid, but it does fit both of the last two diagnostic criteria. Box and diamond mode antispins are radially asymmetric, and the movement of the poi is certainly locally distinct, with one always pointing in as the other points out, despite the hands being in together same. Does this count as a hybrid? Should this count as a hybrid? Is there a way to rule it out that doesn't also rule out vertical versus horizontal CATEYE? We rule them both out. It results in there being 8 variants on CATEYE versus isolation or CATEYE versus extension, despite there only being 4 variants of any other unit circle hybrid. And this is why playing around with hybrids is such a vexing problem. It's difficult to come up with any definition that doesn't have these quirks appearing in it. Do you have answers to any or all of these questions? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. But getting back to VTG hybrids, many of these same hybrids can easily be turned into body tracers as well. For example, if instead of having our hands in split time opposites, we instead perform 4-pedal antispin versus 2-pedal inspin in together opposite, the result is a fun body tracing hybrid that was first popularized by Thomas Nevesol Johansson. It would be an entire video in itself for me to list out every VTG hybrid, so check out the link I've got down in the description for the latest revision of this document, and learn them all for yourself. You should also check out a video I made several years ago called VTG Explained to see a full accounting not just of how VTG hybrids are composed, but also why they make such great transition tools between tricks. I'll link to that up in the cards as well as down in the description. Oh my god, so much poi, but don't worry, you are most of the way through at this point. So our next example of poi hybrids is also one that might surprise you a little bit, because it involves caps. Some cap-based hybrids are actually pretty deceptive. For example, many people learning TRIQUETRA versus pendulum may not realize that the TRIQUETRA in it is actually a cap. This cap is composed of a linear isolation and the bottom of a box mode 4-pedal antispin flower. But there are also hybrids that involve the use of caps being performed by each hand at the same time. When we perform C-caps with the hands together in the poi and opposites, despite the two caps being both congruent as well as radially symmetric, their local movements contrast antispin versus extension. The two hands just trade off which one is doing which. Alien John used to explain it to me like this. Basically, there is an overarching concept that he referred to as composites that's based upon asymmetry of patterns. You can contrast differing patterns between hands, for hybrids, or on the same hand for caps, or both, as is the case of the hybrid that I just showed you. Is your head starting to hurt yet? One of the weirder byproducts of playing around with polyrhythm hybrids is that another possibility for synchronizing two patterns emerges. Let's take the Mercedes for example. Let's say that instead of synchronizing the movement of my hands, that I instead want to synchronize the completion of the two patterns. Now, though the poi are traveling at the same speed, I have one hand moving twice as fast as the other. Weird, huh? Well, it actually gets weirder. Now let's take a very different pattern, an antispin pentagram versus extension. If I synchronize my hands for this pattern, you may notice something kind of odd. It takes 2 reps of the hand path for me to finish the pattern because the number of downbeats in an antispin pentagram isn't a whole number. I could instead synchronize the patterns so they complete at the same time. See how fast my pentagram hand is having to move in order to make this possible? This one is a huge challenge. Finally, I can synchronize the timing of the poi as I perform this pattern. This gives me a totally different result than the other two. I refer to this approach to building polyrhythm hybrids as broken beat or fractional beat hybrids because it literally sometimes requires you to perform them in ways that only part of the pattern gets to finish. Not surprisingly, this also isn't an idea that has become super popular, but it's still a fun mental exercise. Of course, one of the big innovations of the past several years in the poi world has also been the advent of 3-poi spinning, which means that we get to open the doors to contrasting not just 2 patterns, but 3 patterns with each other. I call them tribrids. The only one of those patterns that I can consistently do cleanly is CATEYE versus isolation versus extension. It incorporates elements of unit circle hybrids, antibrids, and just outright nerdery. Crazy, right? And for the last example of hybrids I'll cover on this list, I'll talk about an entire family of tricks that I've only just begun to explore in the past couple of years. Gunslingers. The theory behind gunslingers is that you're essentially turning a single poi into a meteor, and because you can turn meteor weaves into flowers, we are off to the races once again. One obvious approach to this is to take our usual VTG hybrids and apply them to gunslingers. This work is still in its infancy, but the results still look pretty interesting. Of course, things start getting really nuts when you take a look at contrasting a gunslinger in one hand with traditional poi spinning in the other. Some of my favorite results from doing this include extension versus 10-petal gunslinger flowers. And of course, my old favorites antibrids. In particular, I'm fond of that 10-petal gunslinger versus a static spin, or isolation versus 6-petal gunslingers. This one doesn't even require to switch which side of your body you're on. I did an entire video on how you can convert the math of antibrids for use with gunslingers that I'll link to in the description. You know, in case your life needs more math. Wow, so clearly there are so many directions hybrids can go in that I didn't even cover here. This isn't meant to be comprehensive so much as it is meant to introduce you to many of the basic concepts and families of hybrids that have been charted out over the years. Many links to some of the things that I've discussed here down in the description, and I highly recommend diving in and learning more. In the meantime, if you dug this video, please make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you know exactly when I drop a new video. I would also like to throw out a huge thank you to my wonderful supporters on Patreon, who helped me choose the topic of this video, and without whose support, it would not have been possible for me to tackle a topic that is so big and sprawling. If you would like to sign up to support the work that I do, please head on over to patreon.com/DrexFactorToy, and thank you so much in advance.